We
Oh,
have one nation bans gender-neutral language from government agencies.
okay. You might want to get comfortable because I have no idea how long this is going to go for. I have a lot of notes.
That's fair.
Okay, so on the 16th of March, which shows you how long it took me to pick up on the story and also how long it's been since we've done a show. On the 16th of March, with support from the Liberal Party of Australia, a motion put forward by One Nation was passed, which bans some gender neutral language from government agencies' writing and training materials. The motion, put forward by Senator Roberts, rejects quote unquote distorted language such as gestational / non-gestational parent, human milk, and menstruators, largely on the basis that, quote, our biology and relationships, unquote, are allegedly represented through gendered binary terms. The words of One Nation leader Pauline Hanson, however, suggest that the rejection of inclusive language is more an issue of personal dislike. A major source for the motion, providing one of its principal arguments, was Dr. Lyons, a GP from Logan, Queensland, who alleges that children are afraid of using the words boy or girl. And Green Senator Janet Rice attempted to comment on the notion, but was denied permission. So, just quickly, Australia did what? A lot of people very confused by this. The Liberals in Australia are actually our right-wing party, not a left-wing party. So already the story hopefully makes a bit more sense.
Yeah, it's like in the UK, like the only Republicans like we have are people who are like against the crown. So it's different to like America. It's like, okay. But anyway.
Yeah. So Liberals, right wing, they're the equivalent of the Republicans in the US or the Tories in the UK. And then One Nation, I like to call them the Australian Nazi Party because that's what they are. So when my friend first told me about this story, the way she told it was that One Nation had banned all gender neutral language across the board. So like if you were a reporter and you called someone a firefighter, that was illegal. That's not quite true. When I did some digging, it's a bit different from that. So what we're going to do is I'll read the motion in full and then we can spend the next 3 hours discussing all of this. Liberals is in free the money, it wants to go to the top. I think so, yeah. Okay, so the motion. 1055 Senator Roberts to move that the Senate notes that notes that one, our fundamental biology and relationships are represented through the following descriptors: mother, father, son, daughter, brother, sister, boy, girl, grandmother, grandfather, aunt, uncle, female, male, man, woman, lady, gentleman, Mr., Mrs., Ms., Sir, Madam, dad, mum, husband, wife. 2, broad-scale genuine inclusion cannot be achieved through distortions of biological and relational descriptors. 3, an individual's right to choose their descriptors and pronouns for personal use must not dehumanize the human race and undermine gender. 4, Dr. Lyons from Logan, Queensland reports incidences of young children feeling stressed and panicked about whether it is okay to use the words boy and girl. And 5, pushing gender-neutral language is no replacement for appropriate emotional and psychological support for children while growing up. And B, calls on the federal government to 1, reject the use of distorted language such as gestational / non-gestational parent, chest feeding, human milk, lactating parent, menstruators, birthing / non-birthing parent, and 2, ensure all federal government and federal government-funded agencies do not include these terms in their material, including legislation, websites, employee documentation, and training materials. I know that was a lot. I will go through it again more slowly. But before I do, does anyone, did anything jump out at anyone? Does anyone want to jump in with
How the fuck do you dehumanize the human race by creating more language?
I don't know. And I do have a whole section on it.
Okay. It's one of the most human endeavors alive. Creating labels to describe ourselves. That is everything about our species. We like labels. At least a lot of us do. I'm not gonna say everyone because
we like labels. We've even made entire machines to label stuff.
Oh, this is yeah.
When you grasp any straws for your bigotry, that you ban gender-neutral terms in government documents. Yeah. Okay, it looks like no one is going for the obvious, so I'll just jump right in. A1, the list of terms. Sorry, you know when you say appropriate psychological support or whatever, they mean conversion therapy. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. A1, the list of terms. None of these terms, except mother, are related to the banned terms. Is a complete non sequitur. You know,
Yeah.
lady and gentleman aren't biological relational. They're also not appropriate for government writing in the first place. The forms of address, Ms., Mrs., Mr., and Sir, lowercase s, Sir, and Madam, aren't biological or relational either. And the titles don't represent the biology of sexual dimorphism because that's not what they're for. And also because they're not restricted to a particular gender. I haven't legally changed my gender yet, but all of my documents say Mr. on them. So if anything, titles are a tool to distort biology and relationships. They're one of the weapons in the trans
I
agenda.
reject your reality and substitute my own.
Hell yeah. They also leave out Miss. This is like a really nitpicky point, I know, but they leave out Miss, the title which is usually for girls and unmarried women. And given the patriarchal beliefs that are underpinning this whole motion and like the patriarchal tone throughout the whole thing, I can't help but feel like they're implying that unmarried women shouldn't exist or be acknowledged.
It's almost like they're dehumanizing them.
And you know I'll get back to that later, but like, yeah, there's this whole patriarchal tone going throughout the whole thing. And I can't help but feel like they're trying to kind of just ignore the idea of, you know, adult, you know, late 20, even early 20s, maybe late 20s, in their 30s, 40s, being unmarried. That's not allowed according to their biological and relational descriptors. Then there's a point which I'm guessing jumped out at all of you, is that most of these biological and relational terms already have gender-neutral forms, which have been in use for centuries. Parent, child, sibling, child again, grandparent, adult, parent again, and spouse. The only terms with no established neutral counterpart are aunt, uncle, male, female, lady, gentleman, sir, madam, male, and female. Just curious, why does undermining gender and using gender-neutral terminology in official documentation where the person's gender is unknown somehow dehumanize the human race? I don't know.
They're probably going to argue that it's the same as like classifying something as it, which
I think that they do go on to say something like, "Oh, it's denying people's." I don't know. I can't remember. I'll get to it. I'm sorry. There's a lot here. But yeah, final problem with A1 out of this whole clusterfuck is that it's a weird thing to say. Our biology and relationships are represented through the following descriptors is an observation. It's just a description of the way they think things are. They never give a reason why this shouldn't change.
Or why they shouldn't be extended, because no one's coming for your words. They're adding more words to make
I'm coming for your words. I want to eat them for breakfast. Give me your words.
Alpha spaghetti.
Yeah, you know, if I say I am in Australia right now, I'm definitely not suggesting that I shouldn't go to India sometime.
It's just,
yeah. So, you know, there's not an argument. They're saying the way they think things are. They are not forwarding an argument.
pretty much it's this traditionalism whole idea, the idea that like, oh, we got our words from like a tablet found in Athens, Greece, and like there can be no more words.
Well, the thing is, they're trying to argue that we're cutting down on the number of words there are, and I'll get to that.
Yeah,
I'll get to
that's
it.
the same thing as like what was the Nazi that I responded to? So we'll come back to it anyway.
But we can call her Nazi face.
Nazi face.
Alfie. I'm an eldritch being.
Brittany Selner.
That is
Nazi face.
Ethel, am I an eldritch being?
No, you're not quite there yet.
Aw. I'm disappointed. Yeah, A2, the terms allegedly disport. This is why the birdcage can never hold him. I love this meme. The terms allegedly disport biological and relational descriptors. Now, this is based on a fundamental and, I'd argue, willful misunderstanding of how language works. You cannot distort a pair of terms by making an umbrella term for them, since the terms themselves aren't being changed.
Yep.
Mother and father still exist and have the same meaning, regardless of whether or not you group them under the umbrella term of parent. The existence of children doesn't negate the existence of boys and girls, even if some of those children are non-binary and not boys or girls. There are still boys and girls.
This sort of fear-mongering is the same as like by allowing, you know, same-gender marriage, you're like devaluing normal marriage. It's like if same-gender marriage affects your marriage, I've got some news for you.
Yeah, umbrella terms don't change the term. Well, yeah, no, umbrella terms don't change the terms underneath them. If I take the pink marble out of the pink box and the blue marble out of the blue box and I put them in the white bucket, the marbles haven't changed. They're just in a white bucket now. What an umbrella term does allow, however, and I sense this is the true motivation behind the opposition to umbrella terms, is for people to exist outside of the original terms. If we have the pink marble and the blue marble in the white bucket, there's also room in that bucket for a yellow marble, or a purple marble, or a green marble, or one that's pink and green. Even if no one has seen any of these marbles before and has no idea what they are.
Is this you declaring a new hyperfixation for marbles? Sorry, that was terrible.
I can't. I lost mine.
Okay. God damn it. Anyway, yes. Do continue with your point that.
Yeah, there's room for all these different marbles if we have a white bucket for all of them, but not if we only have a pink box and a blue box. So A2, I think A2 again. Broad scale inclusion allegedly can't be achieved through this distortion, but again, distortion isn't taking place.
Clarifications.
Umbrella terms are also necessary for inclusion, as I demonstrated with my analogy there. But what you can't achieve inclusion through is through a rigid bioessentialist binary. If we only have the pink box and the blue box, we don't have anywhere for the yellow marble, the green marble, the pink and green one, the blue and white one.
And there's, of course, a lot of distortion of science here, not just because trans people, but also the intersex community.
Intersex. Yeah.
So it's like, it's always interesting that these people run to biology, it's about biology. But no, they don't actually care about biology and how science changes. It's not, like, that is the best thing about science. It is not a monolithic totem that has to remain standing and never change. It updates. It
when you
grows,
read from your science textbook,
advances.
that didn't come from a tablet in Athens, Greece. It was made by people who,
Newton was an
be proven
alchemist. Newton was an alchemist when alchemy was believed to be a science. We don't teach alchemy anymore because we advanced. But the sort of rhetoric would have us learning alchemy and teaching bloodletting to cure everything.
Surprising no one, it turns out this incredibly bigoted motion is actually anti-inclusion. A3 quotes, an individual's right to choose their descriptors and pronouns for personal use must not dehumanize the human race and undermine gender, unquote, the one you've been waiting for, which is misunderstanding how the right to choose works. People cannot truly choose a gender-neutral descriptor if gender descriptions are forced on them. There's a huge difference between not gendering people on a collective level, leaving them to gender themselves personally, versus gendering everyone a specific way on a collective level and only allowing for gender-neutral language on a personal level. Addressing a classroom full of girls and boys as boys, while only referring to the girls as such individually, is not the same as addressing the classroom as children, while referring to the boys and girls as such individually. If you address the class as boys, you're misgendering the girls while also stating that female identity is something which may only exist in opposition to a male default. But if you address them as children, you're not commenting on their gender identity at all. But undermining gender is based. That is so true. I think I actually have something about that in here. So some people are quick to argue that using non-gendered descriptors is the same as gendering everyone as non-binary, but this is mistaking the non-gendered descriptors we use to encompass the non-binary umbrella as like the proper descriptor for a diverse range of specific genders underneath it, but it's not. A descriptor with room for non-binary genders to exist is not the same as a descriptor which acknowledges them. Otherwise, non-gender descriptors would also acknowledge male and female genders. I'm not sure if that thing I wrote actually makes sense there. I don't remember my logic for that. Under the non-binary umbrella, we don't just have agender people or, genderqueer people or like people who are agender that isn't male or female but is still definitely gender.
We also have gender fluid as well.
We have gender fluid people, of course. I haven't forgotten you exist, I promise. We have non-binary men, we have non-binary women. So the idea that something that isn't male or female encompasses all of these is just wrong. And the idea that every non-binary person wants to be described that way is just wrong. And the idea that the thing is, the reason why we use non-gender descriptors for non-binary people is because we're too lazy to think of something more inclusive than that. The idea that being lazy and just kind of cutting gender out is the same as acknowledging non-binary people is just wrong. A true non-binary counterpart to gendering the collective as either male or female, or both male and female but not non-binary, would be not exactly the same as, but more similar to addressing the collective as gender fluids or gender queers. If I just pretended everyone was gender fluid now, that's more like what they're doing.
Yeah.
So this whole undermining gender thing, I do agree with this. I agree that we're undermining gender here, because to undermine something is to subvert or weaken it. Gender, in this case, is unquestionably being undermined. We are, after all, among other things, making room for people to identify openly as no gender, and for that to be respected. An absence of gender is most definitely a subversion of gender. Though I wouldn't call it a weakness, given how resolute a lot of agender people have to be about their identities. However, the opposition is also undermining gender. They're attempting to erase the acknowledgement of non-binary genders in public, as well as acknowledgement of men who give birth, and non-binary genders are also gender, and gender diversity is also gender. What the opposition is really complaining about is an undermining of the artificial enforcement of binary gender and cis-normativity. They take issue with the default no longer being binary gender as determined by your genitals. In other words, when they say that an individual's right to choose must not undermine gender, what they really mean is an individual's right to choose must not undermine our attempts to enforce the gender binary, which, of course, shows their hand. If an individual's right to choose must not undermine a denial of that choice, that's just a long way of saying the individual must not have a right to choose. I'm sorry, I know I'm saying a lot.
No, nothing to be sorry for. I'm just listening. I'm also reading the chat. Yes.
Okay, good. Good. It's hard to read my notes and the chat at the same time, so that works. And then there's, of course, the idea of dehumanizing the human race, which a lot of you are clamoring for. So this, again, is actually somewhat nuanced, if I may. For one, a lot of proposed gender-neutral terms are overly clinical, which can be dehumanizing. A lot of people find the term menstruator kind of gross and don't like to be called that because it makes them feel dehumanized. I kind of see their point, to be honest. But the solution to that is to come up with better terms, like people with periods as opposed to menstruators. not to abolish gender neutral language entirely.
Mm-hmm.
But what they seem to be arguing is that gender neutral language as a concept is dehumanizing. And again, there is some nuance. As many trans people can attest, being stripped of your gender, if you have one, is dehumanizing, even if the intent isn't to dehumanize. And even for agender people, people who don't have gender, if people are stripping gender from you to be malicious, then you're going to notice that and feel dehumanized, probably.
Mm-hmm.
So, given that, if you're used to government websites gendering you correctly, you might feel a little dehumanized if they suddenly stop assuming your gender. But that dehumanization is different to the dehumanization trans people go through, in that it's a result of privilege. If you never had the privilege of having your gender acknowledged at the expense of other groups, you wouldn't feel dehumanized when those other groups are finally included at the expense of that privilege. After all, government resources, which are designed for both men and women, often use non-gendered language, and no one feels the need to complain about that.
Mm-hmm.
The feeling of dehumanization also goes both ways. Having a gender forced on you when you don't have one, or you have a different one, is also incredibly dehumanizing. And it's much more dehumanizing to be misgendered than it is for someone who doesn't know you not to assume your gender. For example, personally, it doesn't bother me when strangers and people I don't know that well use they, them pronouns for me, but it does bother me a bit when friends do it, even though it's clearly not done maliciously, because I know they know my pronouns. And so it's like, you know who I am. Why aren't you?
There's a difference of expectation there.
Yeah. And the erasure is also different. The erasure of not being specifically acknowledged is different to the erasure of there being no room for you to exist, even in theory. But of course, I've been talking the whole time I've been talking about dehumanizing actual people, but that's not what they actually say. They say that an individual's right to choose their descriptors and pronouns must not dehumanize the human race, which I find worrying on two counts. First, it suggests that the feelings of the human race as a concept should override the rights and needs of real, living members of that race. And since the human race is too diverse for such a specific trait of feeling dehumanized by gender-neutral language to be assigned to it, this can be used to justify undermining any individual's rights whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
I find it worrying when an ideal is put before the needs and rights of real human beings. Ideals are, of course, important, but they're also very easy to misapply. How many times have we seen the idea of free speech used to shut down someone else's free speech? Used to shut down someone's free speech. And second, it also suggests that you need to identify with a binary gender in order to be human. It suggests that non-binary people who don't identify with either male or female aren't human beings. And since a lot of this language is necessary to include trans men, it also subtly suggests that the existence of binary trans people dehumanizes and therefore is a threat to the human race.
Mm-hmm.
This is also an attack on the diversity of the human race and the many ways we can experience consciousness. It's an othering of distinctly human experiences. Ironically, this statement against the dehumanization of the human race is dehumanizing parts of the human experience.
Yeah.
Members of the human race. And A5, and I've not forgotten A4, but first A5, pushing gender-neutral language is no replacement for appropriate emotional and psychological support for children while growing up, which is weird for a few reasons, in addition to obviously being a foghorn for conversion torture.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird because no one suggested replacing anything. We can do both. Trans inclusivity is necessary for the psychological health of trans children. Trans acceptance is an attempt to provide adequate psychological support to children.
Mm-hmm.
Weirdly, they're right. A form of adequate psychological support can't replace adequate psychological support in the same way that figs cannot replace fruits. Of course, when they talk about appropriate psychological support, they mean conversion torture because accepting trans people isn't appropriate in their eyes.
Yeah.
And then A4, we got the Dr. Lyons. And this one...
I was wondering about this one, like, it sounds a bit off the wall, so...
Yeah. Before I get that, I think I'm just going to take, 10 seconds to stop talking. 10 seconds so you don't have to hear me squawking.
Hello, King Cyrus. Not many comments. Yes, hopefully you're enjoying the show. If you're joining us just now, welcome. Sorry, I am completely out of it today. It is going to take me a while to get back into the normal routine of things. But yes, hopefully that will be fine in the end.
I forgot how everything works, but I wrote very detailed notes, so I'm fine.
Okay.
Okay, so I should talk about Dr. Lyons. So first of all, he is a general practitioner. He's not like a gender therapist. He's not a pediatrician. He's not the top of his field. He's just a random GP. I am, the idea of basing a motion like this on the opinion of a single person, even if they are an expert, I'm not sure about that.
Well, don't you know, a single person's a consensus in the mind of the right. That's what it means, doesn't it? But continue.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about the idea of basing a motion like this, controlling language and government agencies everywhere, on the opinion of a single person, especially not just some random GP in some fucking town I've never heard of before. This is just a guy. No federal motion should be based on his opinion, but it was, so we have to have this discussion. So Dr. Lyons alleges that several children were distressed during a routine eye test. An eye test. That is our standard of evidence. So despite the children being between 6 and 8 years old, which you'd think is old enough for them to recognize the letters of the alphabet, the chart they were tested with used pictures instead of letters. And 2 of those pictures were of a girl and a boy. Dr. Lyons observed that 4 out of 5 children were identifying these as pictures of a person instead of a boy or girl, which is fine.
End of the world. Sorry, just cancel everything. People.
Apparently, boys
what
and girls are not
social
people.
Justice nonsense is this? It's dehumanizing to call people people. Don't you know that, Levi?
I suppose the right would disagree with the idea that boys and girls are people.
Yeah.
But he also observed that, and I quote, 2 of the girls exhibited features of anxiety, hand-wringing, frowning, end quote. So this is 2 kids who seem anxious.
Maybe he was staring too much.
Yeah. This could mean anything. Specifically, eye charts. I know a lot about eye tests. I've been wearing glasses since I was 5. My glasses are a -7. Pray for me. Eye charts with pictures on them are more difficult to use than eye charts with letters. Answers aren't as clear-cut. The letter A, on a letter chart, the letter A can only be called A. But a picture of a bucket could also be called, for example, a pail. This isn't such a problem with adults who understand that they just need to demonstrate they recognize the picture, but kids might worry about giving the wrong answer, the wrong label for the object, especially like neurodivergent kids. If you tried to test me with a picture chart as a kid, I would have struggled so much. especially since a lot of these eye charts, like they're either very old or for some reason just have pictures of very old things. A lot of the objects are things that children might not be familiar with. There's also like regional variants, especially in Australia. A lot of these charts will be American or British or something. So you have things that kids might not recognize, like a bread box or one of those weird bed warmer things. Or, you know, objects that they do recognize, but outdated versions that they might not, like a penny farthing rather than a modern bike, or a wooden wheelbarrow instead of a plastic one. So, you know, there's a lot of room for confusion there, which could make kids anxious. And the pictures on this chart in particular, I saw a picture in the article I read, and this chart, the pictures are overloaded with detail, which makes them difficult to interpret, and at least I found difficult to even look at. It was like painful to look at these pictures, even with my glasses on, even with like full resolution, zoomed in as far as I could go. It's just a really unpleasant chart. So I can understand kids being anxious trying to use this horrible, horrible chart. It's also very important to note that on this chart in particular, the boy and the girl are on the second line from the bottom. So these are the difficult pictures where if you have something wrong with your eyes, you're going to struggle interpreting these pictures. Like, that's the point. The point is they're meant to be hard to read. So of course you'd be anxious about getting the answer wrong, especially because these pictures, the girl in particular, are even more overloaded with detail than the other pictures. And like, they have like really small faces and like all this clothing. And it's actually really difficult to tell if the girl is supposed to be a girl or a boy, to be honest. The picture of the boy isn't too bad, but the picture of the girl is really hard to tell what gender she's quote unquote supposed to be. So, you know, what Dr. Lyons interpreted as anxiety over labeling someone a girl in general could have been anxiety over labeling this specific picture of a girl because the children didn't know what they were looking at. The thing is, on the chart, the girl comes first, so they can't use the process of elimination either and think, okay, that one I think is a boy, so this one's probably a girl. You know, it's a bad enough chart. I would not be surprised if the kids were just anxious trying to use this chart. It's also possible that some or all of the children who seemed anxious or you know, labeled these pictures as people were children who failed the eye test because they had some sort of visual impairment. You know, I wouldn't say that obviously every kid who got tested didn't have an impairment, but, you know, for all we know, the children that Dr. Lyons is taking issue with could have actually had eye problems, which made using the chart difficult. So, you know, it's safe to assume that there's at least some bias going on from Dr. Lyons' response. So it's not unlikely that he interpreted generalized anxiety about the eye test, which he's interpreting. It's not unlikely that this is generalized anxiety about the eye test, which he's interpreting as a specific anxiety about the genders of the children depicted in the eye test. But there was this more clear-cut example of a child being anxious about gendered language. Allegedly, one girl said that she wasn't allowed to use those words because her teacher would get angry. And right off the bat, this is not a federal issue. This is an individual issue which needs to be solved within the school, obviously. The child may need to have something explained to her. There may have to be a meeting at the school. Maybe the teacher needs a reprimand or talking to. But the federal government doesn't need to get involved and change all of their government writing because of this one kid. But also, again, this could mean anything. Kids are easily frightened, especially by adults. They will often see anger where it doesn't exist. Kids are also prone to overgeneralize. What this child reports as her teacher telling her not to use those words could have been her teacher telling her, for example, not to deliberately misgender. Well, that too, but maybe the kid could have been told not to deliberately misgender a non-binary classmate. Or the teacher could have told the child that she wasn't allowed to use those words, but in the context of her misgendering a non-binary classmate, it could have just been unclear. Or yeah, you know, the teacher could have said not to assume. there are so many different things the teacher could have said that this child is misinterpreting. But as if that's not enough, Dr. Lyons actually contacted the Department of Education about this issue, if you want to call it that, and they informed him that gender-specific language is not discouraged in Queensland public schools or inclusive programs like the Respectful Relationships Education Program. So this is definitely an individual issue. This could have just been this one teacher being this way. It's not a government program. It's not... The Department of Education isn't pushing this.
Yeah.
I mean, our culture is changing. It could be down to changing culture. If this kid hadn't said it was her teacher saying it specifically, I wouldn't be surprised if she just picked up on it from culture around her, because kids learn a lot of things that they aren't taught in school just from around. But even if we assume that Dr. Lyons' assessment of the issue is correct, the response still doesn't make any sense. Children are frightened by a lot of things and they misunderstand a lot of things. But the solution to that, I've talked about this before when it comes to, trans rights, is that the solution isn't to make those things illegal. If we banned everything children find frightening and confusing, society would collapse. Children are afraid of going to the doctor and they're afraid of tests and they're confused by what they learn in school, but we don't shut down doctors and tests and schools. You explain to children why these things are necessary, and sometimes you just have to let them live with the discomfort. And I remember back when we had a DVD store before Netflix and stuff closed all that down, there was a whole shelf there for R18 plus DVDs. I saw that as a kid. No one said, there are kids in this store, we have to tear down that section of the store. It's only ever queer people who need to be banned because of kids. It's very interesting.
A2 Decay said, I wouldn't be surprised if they're straight up lying about it. They've lied about kids to justify their bigoted plans before, like during the intervention. I've got to agree. That's the thing. Like, this is not being in like a scientific condition or anything. There's no record or transcript. It's just his word. So yeah.
On one hand, I wouldn't be surprised if it was a lie, but on the other hand, I don't know why someone would make up such a flimsy lie, especially because because of the context.
You say it's flimsy, but it's made it to policy level.
That is true.
Like, they don't have to have a good lie so long as the lie aligns with pre-existing bigotry and prejudice.
Yeah, that's true. I just don't understand neurotypicals. I really don't.
But anyway.
Yeah. If this did actually happen, if a kid had an anxiety like that, first thing you say is to say, your teacher isn't here and I'm not going to tell them if you don't. And then you can explain, there's a difference between assuming a real living person's gender and assigning a gender to a drawing. It's a very, very easy to fix.
Yeah. It reminds me of the whole, oh my god, I'm going to have to explain,
it's like
gay marriage to my kid. It's like, yeah, so.
It's very easy to explain. The Graceful Gamer says, when I was younger, I was always terrified of the doctor because I thought I was going to be getting a shot. So the kids could have been scared of something like that. And yeah, doctors are scary.
Yeah. Or it could have been him. He could have been the reason.
I wouldn't be surprised.
But anyway, yes.
Yeah.
Is that everything? I'm sorry.
Sorry. No, I've still got. And of course, this still doesn't make sense because this motion covers government websites, and I don't know about you, but personally, I haven't seen that many children reading government websites at all. Yeah, it's just, it has nothing to do with kids. They are just saying this is bad for kids, therefore we need to ban it, even though it's not for kids in the first place.
Yeah.
Fucking hell. So yeah, Dr. Lyons, he labels this a problem of shrinking language, which I think is very ironic, since he's the one who wants to ban words. But that moves us on to the next section. This is the last section, I promise. If we go back to the version of events my friend gave me, that one nation made all gender-neutral language illegal across the board, this isn't what happened. But I kind of wish that it did, because it would help all of us, especially cis people, see this for what it is. When my friend told me that, I was like, oh shit, it's 1984 time. But, you know, since it's only these new words, which no one really likes, we aren't taking it as seriously. See, I never really went into why these words were banned. I mean, they had their reasoning in the motion, but, like, there's more to it than that. Pauline Hanson made a comment about it, which I mentioned before. She said, quote, she's the leader of One Nation, by the way. She said, quote, "We are fed up with change in the identity of who people are," unquote. So at the end of the day, the government didn't ban these terms because of distorting our biological and relational whatevers and dehumanizing the human race. They banned these terms because they personally don't like trans people. And I'm not saying that's like 1984, even though it probably is, because I don't have to. They've set precedent for banning words they personally dislike from government resources. And that's scary. If you're cis, this probably doesn't seem like a big deal to you, but it should, because they have their foot in the door now. They're eroding your defenses. They're getting you used to the idea of the government banning certain language to deny you recognition, restrict your freedom of expression, and dictate your identity. They did it with new and unpopular words precisely so you wouldn't care. Next time, they may go after older words. And another reason you should care, even if you're cis, is because this isn't just about transphobia, but also misogyny. Sorry, Ethel, did you have something to add?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. Before I talk about the misogyny thing, I'll just have a quick look at chat.
Okay, then I'll... It reminds me a lot of what happened with puberty blockers and, you know, how they use that to undermine Gillick competence in the UK. Like, the person behind it, the lawyer behind it, is against, birth control for young girls, which is where Gillick competence was created, to defend, birth control for under 16s. So, it's the same sort of thing. They target something that they know is not popular and isn't going to get a lot of support. So now they have their foot in the door and they can start targeting the other things. So it is a real worry.
Yeah. We've got some people pointing out that kids are really good at understanding things. And yeah,
If you
really good at understanding things. And you know why? It's because they don't have these prejudices rattling around in their brain, making them think, oh, your gender has to be your genitals because reasons. Kids are really good at picking up on things because you just tell them, like, okay, yeah. But yeah, you should care because this is also about misogyny. And before I do this last section, I just want to reiterate content warnings for allusions to sexual assault, denial of autonomy / violation of consent, misogyny, and queerphobia. See, they didn't just go after language surrounding pregnancy because its novelty made it an easy target. I mean, there's a lot of opportunism in there, but it's also because they do not want to acknowledge that men can give birth. Why is that? Because it's much harder to exploit women when you do. Pregnancy is extremely difficult, and while some of this difficulty is intrinsic to the process, a lot of it is avoidable, or at least ameliorated, with the proper support and healthcare. Thing is, it's much easier to deny the support when you push the idea that women have a unique, magical capacity to endure the hardships of pregnancy, and that enduring them without complaint is the best contribution they could make to their society, and that it makes them strong and special. When you acknowledge that men and non-binary people can also be pregnant, then pregnancy is no longer unique to a woman's identity. And that raises questions about their worth in society in relation to other genders. If a man can also get pregnant and give birth, then how are women special for enduring the difficulties of pregnancy? Well, they're not. So why would they endure those hardships without adequate support, especially when cis men balk at the idea of enduring them at all? More importantly, if men can also get pregnant and give birth, then why shouldn't women derive value for something other than pregnancy and child rearing? But that's a conversation for another day.
Okay.
Acknowledging that men can be pregnant also raises questions of choice. Traditional gender roles divide labor by gender. Women give birth and raise children, while men work to provide for women and children. It's rubbish, of course, but it's also deeply ingrained in our culture. Unless you've done the work to interrogate and debunk that idea, you probably believe it on some level, if for no other reason than because you're familiar with it and because you see it everywhere. The thing about this model is that those roles are static. You either produce and raise the children or you provide for them. You cannot do both and you cannot take turns. Put a pin in that. We also have this idea of pregnancy as compulsory. At its worst, we have incels and other misogynists fantasizing about literally forcing pregnancy on women, but the idea also exists in more subtle forms, through the assumption that women and girls will give birth at some point, through disbelieving and gaslighting women and girls who say they don't want to give birth, and through judging and pathologizing women who don't give birth. And I've experienced some of this growing up as well, of course. It's really pervasive. I have memories of being in high school and like the other girls at school basically cornering me to ask me why I don't want to have kids and be like, but you're supposed to. So, we have this very strong idea in our society that pregnancy is more or less compulsory for women. But when you put those two ideas together, pregnancy as an immutable role and pregnancy as compulsory, then introduce the idea of men getting pregnant, then their system falls apart completely. We can't have everyone getting pregnant because then there's no one to do all the work, at least by their logic. So how do we decide who does what, if not by gender? Well, we can assign it by sex, with anyone with a fertile uterus producing children and anyone without one providing for them. But when the system isn't tied to gender roles and thousands of years of misogyny and normalization, it just isn't convincing. The illusion is broken, and we see the system for what it is. Rubbish. For all these reasons and more, there's no way to include trans people in discussions of pregnancy and childbirth while preserving the patriarchal exploitation of women. This is also true for same-gender couples. This new inclusive terminology is also useful for them, since, for example, you can't distinguish between a gestational and non-gestational parent by calling them the mother and father when they're both women. And that, again, challenges the idea of pregnancy as compulsory for women. And it also challenges the idea of pregnancy as something women do for men. It completely undermines patriarchs' exploitation of women. So while one nation absolutely hates asexual, bisexual, gay, trans, and other queer people for our own sakes, a lot of their hatred is rooted in the fact that we cannot coexist with their misogyny. It's important to recognize that while this is a queer issue, it's not just a queer issue. One nation, with the help of the Liberal Party, is also undermining respect for cis women and undermining their autonomy. And this idea of womanhood as something sacred which needs special acknowledgement is a way of making cis women feel like they're being put on a pedestal when they're actually being torn down. And did you have anything to add to that, Ethel?
I mean, this goes back to the fucking Christian theology and the whole idea of Eve's punishment for being tempted by the serpent and eating the fruit was she have childbirth for the rest of her years, and it shall be in pain. You know, so that there is a really theological basis for this whole rhetoric. And like, you do see it like with people who decide to have like cesarean sections, etc., and how certain people will snipe them as if like they took the easy way out. You know, they don't understand like true motherhood, or you know, the miracle of childbirth because they went for a surgical method. So it is really pervasive for our culture. But apart from that, I don't think I have much to say.
That was an important addition. I hadn't actually thought of either of those things. I was like thinking in the back of my mind as I was writing all this, there's a theological basis for all of this. It all goes back to fucking Christianity. And as much as we like to pretend we're basically in the secular culture, so much, like Christianity is just so pervasive that we have all these horrible ideas that go right back to Christianity. I had no idea how to put that into words or think of any examples.
Especially when it's like fascist rhetoric, and you know, that's always going to be at the forefront. Because they're always going to attract the hard right evangelical sorts and stuff like that, and yeah,